I will begin. This is the title of the talk, To Be or Not to Be a Revolutionary, or the making, or I suppose I could say unmaking of revolutionaries. Might seem rather subversive or blasphemous, coming so close to that climatic moment of our bicentennial celebration. In fact, we are at this point in the very stages of the countdown for the ringing of the bells. In fact, some people have worried about that moment, I guess. I hope maybe that the noise will make the earth shake or something. Well, the thing is that during this euphoria surrounding our celebration of our nation's 200th birthday, it might be rather difficult to convince an audience that the desire for independence was not unanimous, and that the decision for many Americans at that time was a slow and agonizing one, and that the outcome of the debate for individuals and for nations as for our nation as a whole was not a foregone conclusion. In fact, those who favored independence took more than a year after Lexington and Concord to persuade the majority of delegates gathered at the meeting of the Second Continental Congress to approve Henry Lee's resolution that the 13 colonies ought to be free and independent. John Adams once wrote that 1/3 of the colonists favored independence, 1/3 were neutral, and 1/3 opposed the idea altogether. Well, I think that's an oversimplification. And in fact, I think rather than just use the words favored and neutral and opposed, you might say those who favored independence, and the second group, rather than being neutral, and I think was the largest group in the beginning of the struggle, might be called those who long for reconciliation with England. And you had some who were outright Tories, who from the very beginning were sided with the British position. So I think that's a clearer picture. And what happens during this period of time when the debate is going on is that the position of those who believed in reconciliation was being attacked by the radicals who felt that the only solution was that of independence, and also being undermined by British policy, refusal of George III to accept the Olive Branch petition, for example. But I think the description by John Adams is inaccurate for another reason, and that is because it gives a static rather than a dynamic picture of the debate. And as I've just indicated, it was a process by which attempts were made, and successfully made, to move those who favored reconciliation into the camp of those who favored independence. And this debate took place not only up to July 4th, 1776, but after July 4th, 1776, it continued, and that those who held that neutral position of reconciliation found it more and more of an untenable position to hold. Because those who favored independence, radicals, I use that term just to call them something, use coercion rather than debate now, because we've moved from the debating stage into the outright conflict. used all sorts of procedures and coercion to attack those, not only those who opposed their position, but those who remained neutral. So that neutrality became more and more of a difficult position to hold. The radicals, or the set up committees of correspondence. And that's a nice name for vigilante committees, because that's how they operated. And the vigilante committees they were set up private citizens who went around to people's houses and knocked on their doors in the dead of night and discussed the idea of their position on the question of joining the rebel banner. So in other words, as the struggle went on and shifted from debate to actual conflict, the rebels then more and more used coercion as a means of persuasion. Now, this coercion did not suddenly begin after the opening round at Lexington Green. This was a process which really began for some people much earlier, back during the debate over the Stamp Act in 1765. Certainly, if your name was Andrew Oliver or Gerald Ingersoll, the debate began for you very early, because you were a stamp distributor and you were forced to resign your position when confronted by a howling mob. In the case of Andrew Oliver, they tore down his building on the wharf and ransacked his house. This was coercion. And for them, because they had accepted the position of distributor of stamps, they were going to be branded rather early. And they, in a sense, had indicated their sentiments. And so this process then goes on for a long period of time. So we just don't wait for the firing of guns at Lexington Green, or we don't wait for the signing of the Declaration of Independence or for events after that time to really try to divide up. This division started early, and it started in 1765. For those people who were not stamp distributors, it started for you when they brought around a petition asking you to boycott, either to boycott British goods. This occurred as a means of opposing the Stamp Act. It occurred as a means of opposing the Townshend Acts later. And these were successful in forcing repeal. But there were those who were merchants who were reluctant to join the boycott because it obviously meant a loss of income. But the Sons of Liberty or committees of correspondence, later situations, were used as a means of coercion. So that the revolution then, even during this early stage, was quite violent. Obviously, Thomas Hutchison thought so because they attempted to tear down his house one night. Didn't quite accomplish it, but they did a very good job. Got a good start. So it was a violent process and increased in violence, not steady. That is, there were times when there would be lulls, and there would be times when this was not temper or feelings would not be as high as at other times. However, if you were a Massachusetts legislator, you might be branded by the rebels as somebody to be marked for defeat at the next election if you refuse to go along with the position not to rescind the circular letter which was ordered by the colonial office, Secretary Hillsborough, and you were listed as one of the unholy 17, your name was published in the newspaper, and you then would be branded. And so this process continued then to go on or on. There were, in other words, there were a lot of symbolic acts of support or not support. At one time, drinking tea. That you indicated your support for the rebel position by refusing to drink tea. And there were a committee set up of women who not enforce this, but were committees to propagate this idea, not to drink tea, or the kind of clothes you wore. There were times when if you wore clothes that were obviously a luxury, this indicated that you were not a rebel, because one of the things they were trying to do was to boycott luxury items from Great Britain. If you were an Anglican clergyman, your moment came when you were asked to open up your church and preach in support of the rebel cause, or to take up a collection for the poor people of Boston, whose port now was closed by the acts of the Coercion Acts. In other words, you were given a directive, and if you refused, as Jonathan Butcher refused to do, he was met in his church by a mob and ultimately left his church, gave it up, went back to England. So in other words, this process then of declaring your intentions went on for over a long period of time. Sometimes it wasn't always such a dramatic sort of thing. It might have been, for example, that you were rather loose-tongued and you made a remark in a tavern, as one poor fellow south in Charleston did, in which he said something about damnation to America. For these 3 words, he was hauled from his house while sitting at supper, tar and feathered, carted around town for 3 hours, taken to the Liberty Tree, a rope was placed around his neck, and then he was asked to recant by drinking a toast, damnation to all the Tories and success to American liberty. Or hang. Well, he had not heard of Nathan Hale at that time, so he recanted, like most of us would probably do. Well, and a lot of times when we think of this process of tar and feathering, we have a tendency to make light of it simply because it seemed like a kind of a frolic, a lot of people having fun, throwing tar on people and stuff. But people were maimed as a result of it, were seriously injured. And of course, it was a humiliating experience. And remember, a lot of the people that were being tarred and feathered were upper class people who had absolutely no association with the lower classes and were just humiliated by having to be around these people. Well, this is the following excerpt is a description of the process. Quote, it said, the following is a recipe for an effectual operation, tar and feathering. First, strip the person naked. Then heat the tar until it is thin. Then pour it upon the naked flesh. Rub it over with a tar brush. After which, sprinkle decently upon the tar, whilst it is yet warm, as many feathers as will stick to it. Then hold a lighted candle to the feathers, and try to set it all afire. If it will burn, so much the better. But as the experiment is often made in cold weather, it will not then succeed in burning. Take also a halter, put it around the person's neck, and then cart him the rounds. Well, now this was not a very pleasant experience, as one might expect. And so individuals were forced to make a decision, and still, despite these pressures, many of them refused to join the rebel banner and, in fact, exiled themselves. When General Gage withdrew from Boston in March of 1776, about 900 loyalists went with him. And they left all of their belongings. They could take very little unless they happened to be substantial enough to be able to rent a ship, as a few were able to do, and to cart their goods with them. But for the most part, they just left everything. And as a result, not only did they lose it, their personal property, that which they could not carry, but in addition, their real property would be confiscated by the rebel governments. And how many people were loyalists and left? There's no exact figure. Some have put it as high as 150,000. Others have estimated 50,000. I suspect it's someplace in between. But the point is, this was a substantial number of people who refused to join in the rebel cause. In order to try to sort out, as the war went on, those people who were rebels and those people who were not, a loyalty oath was passed by each of the states. And there was a process whereby individuals came before a justice of the peace and took an oath. And if the one, for example, in Rhode Island went something like this: I, blank, here in the presence of Almighty God, as I hope for ease, honor, and comfort in this world, and happiness in the world to come, most earnestly, devoutly, and religiously do swear that I will neither directly nor indirectly assist the wicked instruments of ministerial tyranny and villainy, commonly called the king's troops and navy, by furnishing them with provisions and refreshments of any kind, unless authorized by the Continental Congress or legislature at present established in this particular colony of Rhode Island. I do also swear by the tremendous and almighty God that I will neither directly nor indirectly convey any intelligence nor give any advice to the aforesaid enemies described, and that I will pledge myself, if I should by any accident get knowledge of such treasons, to inform immediately the Committee of Safety. Kind of sounds like the honors code at West Point. And as it is justly allowed that when the rights and sacred liberties of a nation or community are invaded, neutrality is not less base and criminal than open and avowed hostility. I do further swear and pledge myself, as I hope for eternal salvation, that I will, whenever called upon by the voice of the Continental Congress or by the legislature of this particular colony upon their direction, take up arms and subject myself to military discipline in the defense of the common rights and liberties of America, so help me God. And this was passed in every state. And I have a book at home from Lancaster County of Pennsylvania, and it just has, on given dates, the loyalty oath and then the names. And the judge said these people came and they swore before, and the names were there. In fact, this process in Pennsylvania, for some reason, went on all the way to 1787. In other words, it did not end with the peace treaty, but continued all the way through up to about the time of the Constitution. And evidently, people were not forgiving, that if you still had to at some point come in and swear your allegiance to the new government. So this was important. Well, in Rhode Island, for example, individuals would be hauled before the Committee of Safety for having refused to take this oath. And as a result then they would issue out punishment. Colonel Joseph Wanton to be removed to the town of Jamestown and have the liberty of that town under the inspection of the Commander-in-Chief of Rhode Island, and that he be permitted, whenever the said Commander-in-Chief shall think proper, to pass under a guard to visit his farm on Prudence, but to no other place whatever off the Isle of Connecticut. To Augustus Johnson to be removed to the town of South Kingston. To that Matthew Cousins to be removed to Cumberland, and so forth and so forth. And here is a list of the names of people and where they were sent. So that was a process that occurred also during this period. Well, for some individuals, the decision was not too difficult because they had been in the forefront of the revolution. I suppose if we were looking for a revolutionary prototype, we would look at Sam Adams. Because Sam Adams is the kind of a revolutionary that every revolution needs for success. He was a 24-hour-a-day revolutionary. He was the kind of person that sacrificed his own personal welfare and the welfare of his family for the revolutionary cause. Sam Adams grew up in an anti-establishment environment. Not in a poor house. His father was a brewer. Sam had gone to Harvard, had sufficient prestige to be ranked 5th in his graduating class. His poor cousin John was only ranked 16th. Sam Adams' father had been a local politician, involved in selectmen, member of the House of Representatives, one time perhaps even possibility of serving on the provincial council, and had been turned down. So he was involved in politics, but on the side of those people who opposed the policies of the governor and policies of Tom Hutchison and his crowd. And so he came then out of what I would call the anti-establishment mode. But his father was a prosperous brewer, as I pointed out, and merchant, but had conflicts with the establishment over one issue was that of the issuing of paper money. From the very beginning, perhaps, Sam Adams discussed the issue of revolution. His master's thesis was a defense of the position, quote, whether it be lawful to resist the supreme magistrate if commonwealth cannot otherwise be preserved. And so we see from the very beginning a mentality which appealed over the head of legitimate authority to higher law. Well, Sam Adams inherited some wealth, but he was unable to make a success of business. He was a business failure. He studied law to please his father, then gave it up to please his mother. He spent his time instead in politics. He didn't hold very many offices before the Revolution. The offices he held was a minor office, clerk of the market. 1756, he was elected tax collector in Boston, which led to one of the real scandals of any signer of the Declaration of Independence, because his tax collections turned up short, something like 7,000 pounds short. although it was not that he directed this money to his own pocket, because you just look at Sam Adams, you could tell he wasn't spending any. But instead, the indication was that he just never collected the money. And he was a very popular tax collector then. He was continued to be reelected over and over again. Well, his real prominence in politics came when the crisis over the Stamp Act began, and he rode the wave of protest to British policy into political prominence. He was not the leader at this point. The leader was James Otis, but eventually, when he would be carried off mad to the booby hatch, Sam Adams would succeed then his position of prominence. What made Sam Adams so crucial was that he was a superb propagandist and organizer. And this was his real contribution to the American Revolution. He organized, for example, the North End and the South End mobs that used to, every Guy Fawkes Day, attack each other, kind of playing capture the flag, and only with clubs, trying to steal each other's effigies. And he combined them into one mob and then started attacking the Loyalists. So that, and this was a tactic to use the mob as a force of coercion. Now, not everybody will agree on the role of the mob, being whether it was, as one historian has said, a mob was a beast in a cage, and Sam Adams was its keeper, and he could direct it at his enemies, which means that the mob, in a sense, was something that was being directed from above through propaganda and other means. Or did it have its own life? Did it have its own grievances? And in a sense was self-directing. But some historians feel that at least Sam Adams had some control over the mob. And so this was his real contribution during this struggle. Sam Adams, from the very beginning then, saw that the outcome of the struggle as being that of independence, and felt that only separation would provide the freedom that was needed for the colonies to be able to assert their own destiny. Sam Adams was a very religious man. Prayers before meals, passages from the Bible at bedtime, the Lord's Day scrupulously observed in a Puritan manner. And he constantly used the idea of the good old Puritan days as a means of arousing patriotic fervor. What tended to drive Adams more and more to the road of independence was his dislike of British materialism and mannerism and moral corruption. He saw the Revolution as a vehicle for turning back the clock to the good old days of Puritanism, to rediscover the austerity of the New England way. He recruited John Hancock to the cause, who was the richest man in Boston. But he really felt uneasy with John Hancock because he didn't like the way he dressed, and the clothes were too fine, and he drove around in a carriage, fancy carriage, and Sam Adams was suspicious. But of course he was willing to put down these suspicions during the revolutionary struggle. But they did split later, after the revolution. So the point that I'm trying to argue here is that it's natural to think of Sam Adams as becoming a revolutionary because he began in a household that was anti-establishment. He grew up disliking authority. He had a mind that says that if you don't like a law, you don't obey it, that sort of mentality. And so he kept the revolution alive when others thought that the revolution was about to die. He organized committees of correspondence. He drew up blacklists of Tories who supported British policy. He wrote and published in the Boston Gazette. He organized or he wrote diatribes against British soldiers when they were in Boston and tried to, and fabricated, I suppose, stories of atrocities by British soldiers. Kept alive the memory of the Boston Massacre by using the anniversary of the Boston Massacre as a time to remind the Bostonians of British tyranny. He used tactics by waiting until political tactics, for example, as a member of the House of Representatives, by waiting until conservative members had gone home and then brought out radical resolutions, which were then passed by those who were left. A tactic, by the way, which was used successfully by Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses. So we then should not be surprised that Sam Adams was a revolutionary. But in many ways, Sam Adams was not a typical revolutionary. In fact, a study by a historian at USC, John Schutz, has studied more than 2,000 revolutionaries in Massachusetts. And in that study, he concluded that the average Massachusetts revolutionary was prosperous, middle-aged farmer and businessman who feared for their political independence as well as for their economic well-being. And so perhaps if we want to ask ourselves about a more traditional path of becoming a revolutionary, we turn not to the Samuel Adamses, but to a more conservative member of the community, John Jay. Because while Sam Adams came out of the anti-establishment mode, John Jay was an establishment person from the very beginning. Like Sam Adams, John Jay came from a wealthy merchant family. Unlike Sam Adams, who lost it all, John Jay managed to keep it and expand on it. His grandfather had migrated to New York from France in 1690 to escape persecution of the French Huguenots. But he became an Anglican after coming to New York, and I think this kind of indicates partly at least the mentality, because the Anglican Church was the establishment, and as a merchant in New York, perhaps that was the place to go. He studied in New York and became a lawyer, and while Sam Adams was using his energies to arouse the Bostonians against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and British troops and the Tea Act, John Jay was busily studying to become a lawyer and then building up a clientele to become a successful, rich young lawyer. Like his grandfather and father before him, he married into a prominent New York family, the Livingstons, who had long opposed British policies, but not necessarily from conviction, but from political feuding with the other powerful family in New York, the Delanceys. Kind of a struggle of when one was in power, the other wanted in, and vice versa. So in other words, the point here is that he was a political conservative who joined a revolution out of a fear that the movement was being taken over by the more radical element in New York City, He refers to them as the mechanics. And he feared that the mechanics would use this as a vehicle to gain political power from the conservatives in New York. In other words, he joined the Committee of Correspondence to prevent this occurrence. Now, like most conservatives, he opposed British policies, but longed for reconciliation. He supported, during the debate in the Continental Congress over the Galloway Plan, which was an attempt to come up with some method of reconciliation to set up a kind of a super Congress for the 13 colonies. He favored this plan, which, by the way, failed only by a single vote. It was not accepted, but by a single vote, which I think is an indication at that moment that there was certainly a great deal of the mood of conciliation. In an address to the people of Great Britain, which was adopted by the Continental Congress, he stated the constitutional arguments against taxation without representation, which I believe was the fundamental issue separating the colonies and Great Britain, and to demand for a trial by jury, and to defend the dumping of tea into the Boston Harbor. But he ended up stating, despite arguing the position for the position of the colonists, he argued, we will never, and where he would argue, we would never submit to be hewers of wood and drawers of water for any ministry or nation in the world. Yet, he said, he opposed independence and wrote that there are men among us, and such there are in every colony, to whom a disaffection would be an agreeable event. But happily for us, this is not the case with the bulk of the people. So during this debate, he still longs for reconciliation. He still hopes that the differences can be resolved. He is elected and serves in the Second Continental Congress. But at the very moment when the great debate will be going on over whether or not to become independent, John Jay is not there. Where's John Jay? John Jay is home, attending to business, and home for personal reasons, family reasons. Now, I cannot conceive of Sam Adams doing this under any circumstances, but not John Jay. And so, I'm trying to point out here that here was a reluctance on the part of a colonial to make the decision. And yet, when the moment came, on July 4th, he joined the rebel banner and urged those in New York to follow him. He wrote, "While we lament the cruel necessity which has rendered that measure unavoidable, we approve the same and will, at the risk of our lives and fortunes, join with the other colonies in supporting it." In other words, there were many roads then that a revolutionary could follow. Sam Adams traveled the radical and shorter route, perhaps the least traveled by. But John Jay took the more conservative route, the more reluctant, the more agonizing, the longer one, but both men became revolutionaries. Now, the issue then that tended to divide Americans at this point seems to me to be not a discussion of the end, that is, that the colonists ought to be independent in terms of control of their own destiny, but more than the end, it was the means that bothered so many of the colonists. Because while and some would accept this position, that is, those who became loyalists, although they opposed British policies, and they felt that to accept the British position, to knuckle under British power, meant surrender of a certain amount of freedom. To join the rebels meant surrender to even a greater tyranny, the tyranny of the mob. To them, the revolution was beginning to be equated with a breakdown of law and order. Even such a staunch rebel as John Adams could have second thoughts about the consequences of a revolution. One time, as he was returning home from the Continental Congress, he was accosted by some countrymen who exclaimed, quote, "Oh, Mr. Adams, what great things have you, your colleagues, done for us. We can never be grateful enough to you. There are no courts of justice now in this province, and I hope there never will be another." And Adams says to himself, is this the object for which I have been contending, said I to myself, for I rode along without any answer to this wretch. Are these the sentiments of such people, and how many of them are there in the country? If the power of the country should get into such hands, and there is a great danger that it will, to what purpose have we sacrificed our time, health, and everything else? So for many Americans, or colonists at that time, it was a very reluctant and agonizing decision. But it was not an unthinking decision. It was a decision that took place with many people over a very long period of time. When the shot was first fired on Lexington Green in the early morning hours on April 19th, there was not an overwhelming desire for independence the next day. For some, yes, those who grabbed their rifles and started taking pot shots at the British as they marched back from Concord. But for most Americans, the decision was still to be made, long and agonizing. And that is the kind of thing that I think we need to think about when we're celebrating the bicentennial. To think in terms of individuals having to be faced with this decision, being tugged by tugs of loyalty towards Britain and tugs towards the rebel cause. Most reluctantly perhaps, but ultimately sided with those who favored independence. Some did not. Most of those left. Nevertheless, the decision was made, and I suppose that's why we're going to sound the bells on Sunday at 1 p.m. right here on the Iowa campus. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. If there's anybody that will have anything they'd like to. Yes?
That third division that you set up, a third, and a third, is that been just the latest revision out? I used to run into about 10%.
At what?
Were really hardcore revolutionaries in the American Revolution, and then another 50
Yeah.
or 60%
Well,
didn't care at all, and then
yeah.
there's another 20% on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
I mean, just really small, almost
Yeah.
parallel to what the Russian size majority was.
Well, the one third comes from John Adams, and I think it depends on when you're talking about the sentiment towards the revolution. If you're looking at it after the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, you're talking about a very small group. If, on the other hand, you're looking at the decision in 1776, I think you're talking about a very much a greater group. But no referendum was taken. That's why I like the idea of movement and a group that wanted to reconcile the difference. And part of those people, I mean, you take, for example, John Dickinson, who proposed the John Dickinson Plan, which is the Olive Branch Petition and so forth. He joined the rebel army. On the other hand, Joseph Galloway, both of them friends of Franklin, both of them living in Philadelphia, joined the Loyalists and ultimately was exiled and his property confiscated and branded as a traitor. So they go both ways, but I think most of them, because of the organization, and now you may be right in one way when you say the 10%, you talk about that 10%, I mean, who knows in a sense, I guess. But we go by loyalty oaths. The question is how many people went freely to give loyalty oaths, how many people were coerced? And can 10% coerce the vast majority? Well, depends, I guess, where that 10% is. I think it depends also where you are. If you're in Boston, I think that in New England, 10% would be a very, very low figure. If you were in South Carolina, that would be different. Or in Pennsylvania, different. But ultimately, I think, as we go through the whole period, at least as I see it, that we get more and more people are rebels and fewer are in that reconciliation area, and those who are rebels maybe remain a kind of a constant, but they then are lead.
Do you have a progression out toward the west at all, or are they going back to England?
Oh no, they're going to England.
They are going back.
Oh yeah, England. In fact, the English treat the Loyalists superbly. You know, when you contrast the way we treated our supporters in Vietnam when we brought them out, and contrast that treatment that we have now, you know, I can contrast that with the British set up commission. People appealed. People were paid off handsomely, gained pensions, were given land up in Canada. They really brought their people out with them, including black Americans, who I think were in a great dilemma, because to fight for Great Britain was to gain freedom. To fight for the rebels was to remain in slavery. Reconcile that with the Declaration of Independence.
I think at one point Friends in Philadelphia who signed loyalty oaths were read out of meetings. This about the great turmoil in the
Because, in other words, you move from a neutral position.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And there was, I would say, we would call a group of the indifferent, or for you to say, there were many for religious reasons, and that's one of the reasons why Pennsylvania was you might call it not necessarily a loyalist stronghold, but it was an area that was not very strong for the revolutionary position. Although the radicals were better organized, and I suppose you might argue in Pennsylvania is one example where a minority probably got their will because of their better organization using coercion. See, I mean, but you're right. I'm glad you brought that up because of the idea that the Friends I know would be one example of religious.
That coercion point is something that coercion in the nighttime. There's arguments too that they moved the nighttime to circumvent the British troops. Now, is that just a ploy? Or were they actually using the nighttime to coerce the people? I mean, the cover.
I know. Whenever we think of coercion, we always have images of doing it in the dead of night. Not how we do it. You never do things like that in the light of day, do you?
But what I'm saying is you got British troops during the light of day.
Oh, no, but not in not out in the countryside.
Oh, I see.
Not in, I mean, between March of '76 and July of '76, there wasn't one single British troop on a colonial soil. However, by the first week in July, they had 30,000 pouring ashore in New York. But the British troops were never in control any place in New England out away from Boston at one point, and then they lost control of that in March. And then they were up in Rhode Island during the war. But, I mean, really, this enclave is very simply reminiscent of Vietnam, I think.
Curious, what percentage of Parliament favored the deployment?
Well, you had support. I mean, you can look at certain issues, for example, and certain debates on certain things, and you will find, like, for example, the Stamp Act, that was, when it was originally passed, there was a minority of maybe, a fourth, something like that, who opposed the Stamp Act. But then they repealed the Stamp Act, and so you might say at that point, a majority at least thought it was unwise. When you get right down to the real, when the hardliners are in control, and after the Boston Tea Party, and they pass the coercive acts, and the coercive acts are when, as far as the hardliners are concerned, we've had enough. When you look at the vote for the coercive act, the closing of the Port of Boston, I think something like 1/5 opposed it. And so that would be that to me would be if somebody's willing at that point to oppose the British policy. But as the war goes on, just like another thing, I think that becomes more and more of an untenable position, although some people remain in opposition to the war as time went on. But, I mean, you had voices. I mean, everybody talks about Edmund Burke and some of these people, and you certainly had a number of people that, just like in Vietnam, you had some who were from all the way through opposed to the war. But then as the war went sour and the lives and the casualty figures came home and the costs mounted, and then as they got engaged with France, Spain, and Holland, and everybody else, they just began more and more, the opposition grew up. And I think that Yorktown did not defeat the British Army. Yorktown just convinced the British ministry, Lord North, that to continue the war was going to not be worth it. I mean, and to me, it's similar to Vietnam. I am convinced in Vietnam that had Johnson passed high taxes in '66 to pay for the war, it would have been out much earlier. Because I don't think the Americans would have paid for it. But as long as you can pay for it with somebody else's kid, and then you don't mind. But of course, as soon as it got to be our kids, then we started opposing it. Well, not we, meaning, but I mean the general middle class American.